This episode of Shadowversity is brought to you by the release of my debut novel, Chronicles of Everfall, Shadow of the Conqueror, which is out on the 1st of July. 2019, in case you end up watching this video, like, next year. It is currently available for pre-order in ebook and paperback, and the audiobook, which is narrated by Michael Kramer and Kate Redding, will be coming out a little bit after the official release date on the 1st. It's the story of the deposed, presumed dead, tyrannical emperor of a fantasy world when he sets out on a journey towards redemption. For who better to fight back the darkness of the world than the one responsible for most of it? Links are in the description below for the pre-order, and if you end up watching this video a few days after it's gone live, my novel should already be released. Please do go check it out. If you love epic fantasy and grand tales, then this novel is right up your alley.
Shadowversity.
Greetings, I'm Shad, and welcome back to Fantasy Rearmed. Now, in this series, we try and take a look at fantasy from a more realistic, or at least functional, practical perspective, trying to see what weapons would be better suited to certain races, and what fantasy tropes don't kind of make sense when you just apply some real-world conditions upon them. But there is a fairly basic but important element in this idea of what would a fantasy world really be like that we haven't looked at yet, which is still pretty darn important, and that's like, what about the regular person, everyday life, the village, the town, the cities, okay? What would these fairly large elements of people's lives, which are the center points of society, how would they be affected in a more realistic way if we really tried to go through the logic here in a fantasy world that has to deal with things like monsters and magic? Now, magic can be really tough to analyze accurately because it is very subjective and setting dependent, okay? So it really depends on how the magic operates, what it does, for us to be able to figure out how it would affect a fantasy world. I can give some examples, and then you would need to try and take this idea and apply it to your own world, your own settings, or whatever. For instance, if the magic can create food, all right, that alone is huge, okay? Especially looking at a setting with medieval technology. The struggle to create food reliably and consistently was a struggle, okay? There were times of famine, and if they could turn to sources of magic to, produce food, well, that, of course, is a big thing. But if you can produce food easier through magic than through general farming, that can turn an economy on its head completely. It'll just throw chaos into the cost of food as well. And of course, this comes into the idea of the quality of food on top of it. Another thing that would just throw a world setting on its head in terms of how we look at medieval fantasy as a medieval kind of setting is if there is magical healing in the setting. That would, of course, alter the average length of life in a very big way. That means a medieval setting would have to deal with, generally, higher population growth. How do they take care of their elderly? Because they'll have a much higher elderly population if people aren't dying so often at a younger age. For instance, a good example in how magical healing affects the society of a fantasy world is actually an example from my own novel, Chronicles of Everfall, Shadow of the Conqueror. There are 3 types of magic in this setting: light bringing, light binding, and light blaring. Light bringing is a power that comes out of goodness, light binding is a neutral power, and light blaring is an evil power. Light bringing is the magic that can heal, and if a person devotes their entire life to serving others, there is a chance that they will naturally develop this magic, and as a result, there are light bringers who travel the land and heal those that are sick and afflicted. A natural result of this is that the medical technology of this world is horrible, because they rely on the magic to heal, and therefore barely anyone has done any research in how to handle infections, diseases, and just sickness in general. This is a great source that I can draw upon to create conflict in the story when there's an injury or sickness and a Lightbringer isn't present. It means people in this world have a much more difficult time handling such things, but on the other side, the flip side to this, with a Lightbringer nearby, they are able to handle sicknesses and injuries so much easier, far better than we even can in the modern day. And so generally, people's lifespans are longer as another natural result of this magic being present in the setting. One of the ways you can kind of fix some of these larger impacts on a standard medieval type setting through magic is if the magic isn't nearly as prominent or common, okay? If it's more mysterious, fewer people have it, well, it's going to have less of an impact, of course, but you still need to have a look at how it would affect in terms of how it would create myths, legends, mistrust. How is it looked at in regards to religion, okay? All these things need to be considered. Another thing to consider is magic's destructive capacity. Okay, how powerful is it in regards to combat? If you can launch a projectile with better accuracy than other known projectiles, which have a greater chance of killing an opponent, well, when someone says, I want to kill someone at a distance, their default would be try and use magic if it's not taboo, easier to learn, if there aren't kind of requirements, if there isn't a barrier, or you have to be specially born to be able to use it, people would default to using magic over arrows all the time. Heaps of things to consider there. Good luck, it'll depend on your setting. Let's move on now to monsters, because monsters, well, they seem to be a bit more uniform in regards to certain types of fantasy settings, like the classic goblins, roaming monsters, undead, and other things like that. Those creatures seem to be fairly consistent in medieval fantasy settings, but what we don't often see are realistic changes in the society as a result, all right? If there are monsters roaming the lands, okay, and there's a chance that your lone village can be raided by goblins, orcs, trolls, gnolls, kobolds, ogres, bugbears, and the list just goes on and on, all right? You can bet that that would affect certain things. One of the first things is that I find it very hard to see any village at all not having some type of defenses or walls around it. And in actual fact, people would group together far more often in a setting like this than not, okay? Safety in numbers. You can have someone on watch all the time and rotate it so it's not just dumped on one person. If you get attacked, you can get all the strong people who are fighting fit to group together to fend off the attacker and stuff like that. So in a more classic fantasy setting, the lone farmstead, just, you know, outside of the village or even in the wilderness, I would basically see to be non-existent. It would almost be complete suicide. And on top of that, when people need to go out and work the fields, it would make sense to have some type of armed guard accompanying them, okay? The town guard, town militia, or whatever, and the farmers, like not only farmers, just everyone in the world would be carrying weapons, okay? Self-defense would be hugely on their minds. If there's a fact that a goblin might just jump out of the bushes and attack you at any given moment, my goodness, the idea of a disarmed society just boggles the mind. No one would put up with it. They was like, no. The exceptions to this, okay, is if you're in a very protected city that has an established city guard and stuff like that, well then in those instances, certain weapon restrictive laws could be in place inside the city's boundaries. If you're wanting to know what the weapon restrictive laws were actually like in the medieval period, I have a whole video dedicated to that subject on the specific sword carrying laws of the medieval period, and that'll help inform us looking at it in a fantasy perspective. But even in this, you know, city that has an established town guard and stuff like that, where are they getting their food, okay? People are going to need to leave the safety of this fortified communal area, whether that's a village or a city. They need to go out, work the fields, okay? And because they don't have modern technology and stuff, that means their level of production is on a medieval standard. So to produce certain quantities of food, they need greater land area to do it than we need in the modern day, and more manpower. In a setting like this, could actually be a bit flipped on its head, where we kind of think that medieval peasant farmer, okay, in a historical setting, well, a farmer could be a noble, brave kind of occupation. It's like, you're a farmer, you go out into the open where monsters are and stuff like that, and you work the field, and you know, and in actual fact, the average farmer, not only really the average farmer, the average citizen, it is very likely that they would have seen combat against these monsters at some point in their life. So their martial capacity and training, on average, would be really, really high. Now, of course, this would always be affected by the level, the frequency of these monster hordes roaming the land stuff, how frequently they attack, how great are their numbers, and how safe is the general civilized lands. If there is known that, you know, inside the kingdom's borders, like, monster attacks are very, very rare, okay, some of these more extreme results in terms of the armed populace and stuff like that, walls around every city, might be a bit different, yet still, the mere fact that it is possible there could be a monster attack is something that just simply didn't exist in the medieval period. Now, in the medieval period, what were you worried about? possible bandits, okay, waylaying you, assaulting you, wolves, maybe. People carried weapons as the result of that. Now, in a fantasy setting, we have that and add possible monster engagements on top of it. So I think even if it's rare, because of the fact that it's a possibility, that would alter the frequency and mindset of that people would have in terms of martial culture. They would train more, they would carry weapons more, just as a general practice completely. And then, like we were talking about previously, if you ramp that up, well, simply traveling outside of these secured, cities and villages would be a really dangerous thing. Like, there could be set like groups or dedicated guards that travel from one location to another, almost like a timed bus route or something like that, where you need to catch the next guard traveling to X location because you need to travel with protection, all right? And there's a dedicated thing in the society just to travel, all right? And these are guard protectors moving from one to the other, and that means these groups of travelers would end up being fairly large in number because the traders, the farmers, anyone just wanting to travel to visit someone or go on pilgrimage or whatever would always need to conform to when a certain guard is traveling in that location. But that would also make them larger targets because there's more people, but that could also deter being attacked because there's more people who are armed, ready to fight. So all these things to consider. The advantage is that monsters usually are less intelligent than humans, and so simple kind of things like this could solve the problem. And for instance, to overcome certain types of defenses, like a big solid castle wall, that takes a lot of ingenuity and creativity. Like, if you want to know the lengths that some people had to go through to try and besiege certain castles, look at my video on sieges and historical sources, the things that people did. Whoa! And if the creatures aren't aware of these ideas, I don't see them really coming up with them. But there's good fantasies, okay? Fantasy settings that go through some of this logic. For instance, the anime Goblin Slayer. Goblins are not intelligent, but when they see something that is working and is effective, they know that it's effective and they copy it, all right? And so sometimes people are reluctant to use certain weapons or techniques against goblins because then they will learn from it and become more dangerous as a result. It's a good creative thing to keep in mind that was in fantasy property already done. And that is something that you would need to consider in your own fantasy settings, whether it's for role-playing, for writing, anything. And it's that if monsters can adapt and learn, how clever are they? And if they're not smart enough to employ certain siege tactics, well, a big old wall is really effective. In fact, another anime that, applied this logic really effectively is Attack on Titan, all right? In Attack on Titan, it's all about giants, okay? And they're not that intelligent. And so what they use for defense are these huge, monolithic, massive walls. And they are mostly effective. They do the job. Problems arise. Go watch the anime if you want to know what those problems are. But for the most part, it's effective. It's an appropriate solution to a problem that exists. And that's something that you need to consider as well, because in Attack on Titan, they just did a huge wall that actually encircled the farmland that they needed to produce food. So that would mean you wouldn't need a protective kind of group to go with the farmers to protect them while they're working the fields because they got a wall surrounding them. But having said that, walls need to be, generally guarded or at least patrolled to see if there's any breaches or anyone trying to climb over them. And so as soon as you add a wall, you also increase the requirement of the manpower to man the wall effectively. Another logical conclusion about looking at a world that has to deal with monsters regularly is something that most fantasies have kind of covered to some extent, especially Dungeons and Dragons, okay? It's the idea of the adventurer, an individual whose whole profession is in some way dedicated to dealing with monsters. Now, in classic fantasy, the adventurer isn't really just a monster hunter. They can be a treasure hunter. They're going out for adventure, not killing monsters per se. And so a natural extension to this idea of the adventurer is the monster hunter, monster slayer, goblin slayer. But to a larger extent, it would be a far more common profession where people that's there. In actual fact, I could see it becoming organized where cities, towns, there might even be a dedicated guild, an adventurers guild or a monster slaying guild, right? Where even if it's a smaller village, there's a group of people whose sole job is to try and keep the area around that village safe. They go out and they hunt for the monsters. You see, we humans, all right, we don't like being killed. Not at all. And when anything happens like this, where food is stolen or someone is killed, especially if there's a loved one, we can be rightly vindictive. And if it's, say, like an animal that killed one of our own children, we hunt out that animal and we kill it because that thing is not living. It not only threatened, it killed one of our loved ones, it's dead, all right? Take that logic, extend it now to monsters. They are always present to threaten the lives of our loved ones. It would be priority number one in this society to wipe them out, almost, depending on the level, okay? And so the classic fantasy setting, in my mind, perhaps doesn't capture the true vitriol and hatred, and priority would be in these settings to wipe them out, all right? And as a result, you might actually see less conflict between nations fighting each other because they have a much greater, more prominent and consistent common enemy. And in actual fact, it would be more common for these nations to ally against the monsters and try and wipe them out because it's threatening everyone. And so this raises an interesting problem in fantasy that I haven't really seen kind of come up too much. And it's the idea of, how would humans let these creatures live so long in a fantasy setting where it's like this kingdom has been around for 1,000 years and monsters have always been there? If monsters have always been there, why the heck haven't we wiped them out? They're killing our children, they're killing us, they're taking our food, they're attacking our cities. Why aren't we wiping them off the face of the map? And so you could have a fantasy setting where perhaps it's already done and the monsters are rising again. Or it would be logical to add in some type of mechanic to explain why they are so hard to wipe out. Do they breed faster? Do they live in locations that we just can't get to? Are they slipping into our world from another realm, another plane of existence, you know, Elfheim or something like this? And in actual fact, I use that setting element in one of my old books that I had written. Old book, it's not, you know, not up to the proper standard, so it's not getting published. Well, what was that? Another thing to consider is, how do the monsters attack, okay? Do they only attack people, or are they more nefarious, okay? Do they understand that humans rely on their farming, their crops, and so do they come in and would they attack the crops, burn the wheat fields and stuff? If they did that, that's a huge problem, okay? That means the wheat fields would need to be protected and guarded, or at least patrolled almost constantly, if not just a wall being built around them, Attack on Titan style. Do the monsters only come out at nighttime? This is an interesting element that, you know, we can consider. Certainly in Lord of the Rings, goblins and orcs hate sunlight. It doesn't kill them, but it makes their legs wobbly and they get dizzy and even a bit sick and they don't like it. I know this because I've just been recently rereading The Hobbit. That would absolutely affect things because that would mean nighttime would be a hugely, like, scary, dangerous thing. Who would go out at nighttime would be a big risk. You would want protection. You would want guards going with you if you're traveling at nighttime, of course. Undead, my goodness. Like, seriously, if undead existed in the world, every single corpse, someone when they died, they'd all get burnt. Burnt to, like, just burying someone to the chance that their corpse might, you know, rise from the dead. They're never going to happen. And that's interesting because if, you know, cremation is prominent so much in a world where undead is common, like, even though there's chances that undead could be around, where would they be coming from? Like, a world could have it fairly well controlled if cremation is such a strict, constant thing. And of course, that creates an interesting setting element when someone's corpse isn't cremated, burnt. Now, there are monsters in my own novel, of course, so what did I do to try and address some of these logical implications? First, where are they coming from and why are they so hard to eradicate? Well, Everfall is a world of perpetual day, and this is quite significant because any person who is trapped in darkness for the period of 24 hours turns into a monster, what is called a shade, and they obtain that evil magical power called light blaring. They lose all their humanity and become insane, bloodlusting, crazed, savage monsters without any mercy. This, of course, has made people very afraid of darkness, but sometimes accidents happen, and the Shade also try to kidnap people to enhance their numbers as well. One of the logical implications of where these monsters actually come from is that the world is very, very strict in records. They keep an annual census of every single person in the world to try and keep track of missing persons and who might have disappeared and been turned. When there are enough Shade, they are able to group together and pool their light-blaring powers to push back the light over the entire world and cast night upon the land. Nights are apocalyptic events in the world where the Shade just spew forth out of deep caverns in the ground to try and wipe out all life, and everyone has to fight as a result on this because it is so desperate. It's through desperately using sunstones and other sources of light that people are able to prevent being turned. As a result of the looming threat of an oncoming night, every person in the world carries swords and learns how to use them. There is a massive sword culture within this world setting as a natural result of the type of monsters that exist in it. But this has also affected the underlying culture, where dueling has become a very socially respected thing and a means whereby one can gain prominence and prestige. They display their victories on tassels. Now, of course, I can't go into every single element because the setting is very detailed, but this is just some examples of what I personally have done to try and look at the logical implications and effects that monsters would have on a society if it actually existed. So all these things, fun things to consider, and what do you think, okay? Because there's so much, I can't cover it all in just this video, but at least, hopefully, I'm giving some ideas, inspiration, pointing us in the right direction of the things that should be considered in a fantasy setting, just the regular people, society. How do they live? How do they get their food? How do they build their homes? How do they protect themselves? How do they adapt to these things, whether it's magic or monsters? So I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please do share them, and of course, I hope to see you in the next video. So until that time, farewell.